J. Baba. So I heard about Mayor Baba in spring of 1968, but I'll give you a little background of an event in my life just prior to hearing about Baba. In the summer before 1967, I was a foreign exchange student. I was going between my junior and senior year in high school, and I was going to Santiago, Chile to be a foreign exchange student. Prior to leaving, I got a series of inoculations: polio, tetanus, typhoid, yellow fever, the whole bunch of them. But I got them all at once. And what happened was when I got to Santiago, it was cold there because it was summer up here but winter down there. And one of the reason I went is because I wanted to ski in that time of year. With a few days, I got a cold, and then a few days later, after that, I started feeling really sick. And that morning that I felt really sick, I tried to walk back from the bathroom to a bed, my bedroom, and I literally fell flat on my nose. I had gotten pins and needle feelings in my fingers and in my toes, and then that gradually got weaker and weaker, and I literally couldn't even take a step. I had no muscle strength, and I just fell flat on my nose. They got a doctor to come. The family got a doctor to come. I was staying with a family in Santiago, and the doctor he diagnosed it as being Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a paralysis. It's an autoimmune paralysis, and he said that I would gradually get weaker and weaker, but eventually it would all come back. And sure enough, they took me to a hospital, and within a day or so, I couldn't even swallow. They had to put a tube into my stomach, down my throat, until I could get food. And then I got to a point where I couldn't breathe. And they rushed me from one hospital to another hospital. They started giving me artificial respiration and oxygen at the first hospital, and realized that they needed to take me to another hospital that had a iron lung or respirator. And so while I was going from the one hospital to the next hospital in this ambulance, rather fast through downtown Santiago, with two doctors in the front, two nurses in the back, the nurses were asking in Spanish, "Oxygeno, oxygeno," and the doctors were responding kind of like in fun in English because I spoke English. Obviously, they didn't speak Spanish. Actually, that was another factor. And they were joking, and I was thinking I could die because I couldn't breathe. So they were giving me artificial respiration and oxygen, and I had this kind of flash of seeing my parents, visualizing my parents and how upset they would be with me if I died. My mother being upset that I didn't take care of myself. Kind of Jewish guilt type thing. So they got me to the hospital, and they said, "Now we're going to have to strip you here in this hallway." And it was like the lobby of the hospital. I was on a stretcher, and they said, "You're going to put on clothing from the other hospital." And I was thinking, well, that's awfully cheap of them to worry about this clothes that I'm wearing, that it has to go back to the other hospital and just strip me right there in the lobby. Well, it turned out they were actually taking me to a floor that was a sterile, I guess, wing, you would say. So anyway, they got me in there, and there's a nurse. They put me into this iron lung, and the nurse begins explaining to me that I have to try to breathe in rhythm with the machine. And then she has this like vacuum. She's sucking out all this stuff in my lungs that had gotten in there, all this liquid that begins to form in your lungs that if you don't breathe. A priest came by, and the priest began to ask me some questions. The nurse says he doesn't speak Spanish, so he asked me if I'm Catholic, and I start trying to explain to him I'm Jewish. And the next thing I know, he's throwing some water on me. And I'm thinking, oh, that's nice of him. I'm sweating. He's trying to cool me off. In the meantime, the nurse is like giving him an elbow, trying to get him out of the room. I didn't realize that the other two doctors were there because they were thinking that I may need to have a tracheotomy, the hole cut in the throat. Fortunately, I didn't need that. And long story short, I spent 10 days in the iron lung, and while I was in there, I had this thought that, boy, just the simple things in life would make me happy again. It was like being in a sensory deprivation room where you have absolutely no sensation at all. In other words, I couldn't really feel much because what the illness is a swelling of the myelin sheaths around the nerves, which makes it impossible for electric signals to travel as they normally do through nerves. And so that's what causes paralysis. A certain number of people die every year. A certain percentage of people die who have this illness. And fortunately, I was not one of them. What happens, it goes up the spinal column, and if it should reach the brain, then you actually die. Fortunately, I didn't get that far, but it did have paralysis in the lungs and in the whole body. So it's after 10 days in the iron lung, then it was 6 weeks of rehabilitation in Santiago before I could actually fly back and have another month of rehabilitation in Pittsburgh, where I lived. So again, this idea was, I felt, almost like a yogi in a cave in a way. I could talk. I did a little bit, but not much. Couldn't feel anything, and I think part of the thing was just feeling desireless in a way. It's like just the simple things in life would make me happy again, like being able to ride in a car or eat. I couldn't eat for that period of time. I say all this because I think it was in some way a preparation, because 9 months later is when I first heard Baba's name, about Mayor Baba. And that happened by TV. My parents regularly watched the show called David Susskind. And the David Susskind show was the first sort of talk, interview, television show, kind of like what Larry King became, Charlie Rose now. And it was on PBS, or educational TV back then. And it was kind of highbrow, and David Susskind always had interesting guests. It was really my parents who always watched it. I would tune in occasionally if the show was interesting, had an interesting topic for me. And I was a senior in high school. So what interested me was when they had a show about LSD. And not that I had done LSD yet, but I was certainly aware of the whole hippie movement and aware of the whole counterculture beginning to take shape. And so I was intrigued. So people on the David Susskind show, several panelists, two women who had experimented with LSD in college and were reporting that they were having religious experiences using LSD. There was a psychiatrist on the show who was saying LSD was dangerous. And there was the other viewpoint was coming from Alan Cohen, who was saying that he had experimented with LSD while a student of Timothy Leary's at Harvard, and he had gone beyond using LSD. He had studied with Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who later became Baba Ram Dass, and Alan was a PhD in psychology from Harvard. Alan said that he had given up using LSD because he found that by following Mayor Baba, he could better achieve what he was hoping to achieve by taking LSD. He said that LSD expanded one's mind, and that meant LSD opened up the unconscious to the conscious mind. And that's why one hallucinated and so on. He said Meher Baba had full consciousness of the unconscious mind, and that meant he was God conscious. So Alan gave up using LSD because he found by following Meher Baba that was a better pathway to this higher state of consciousness. Then he said that, talked a little bit about Meher Baba. He said that he came from India. He said he was silent. He said that the world was at a place of chaos, and when Meher Baba would break his silence would be at the point when the world chaos would reach a climax, a peak. And at that point, Baba would break his silence and it would begin to usher in a new humanity. And I was intrigued by what Alan was saying. And I remember the two women who were on the show who were explaining they were having religious experiences with LSD. David Susskind said to them, "Come on, you know this sounds absolutely ludicrous." And they said, "Well, you think this is ludicrous? What about that guy over there, Alan, who's claiming that God's walking on Earth?" And I thought that was pretty funny. Now, at this point in my life, I actually have become an atheist. I had kind of developed a strong interest in science. My religion, Jewish background, didn't really have relevance in my life. It didn't really seem to be answering fundamental questions that I wanted to have answered. And so, from about the age of 16 till I heard about Meher Baba, I kind of had drifted to being an atheist. So when I heard Alan say Meher Baba was God in human form, I didn't believe it. And I felt, well, what Alan is talking about is similar to like Maharishi Mahayogi, and the Beatles were into Maharishi Mahayogi. This is becoming a new fad or phenomenon. So I felt, this Meher Baba could be a new fad or phenomenon, and I could be on the ground floor of this. So that was one of my first thoughts. And the other thought I had was like, he's in India, people starve in India. And my image of India was like one large refugee camp, or one large plain of people starving, and a man would walk around like a figure, like a Jesus figure, and comfort people. And I thought, well, okay, so if someone was giving comfort to other people like that, I could see how other people would believe he's like a Christ-like figure. But I didn't believe what Alan was saying. But I said, there's one chance in a million that it could be true. And it turns out this one chance in a million plays into my story as time goes on. So the next day, I told a couple of my friends about what I'd seen on TV. One friend asked me, well, what difference would it make if this guy's God? I said, well, it's all the problems I'm having in life, which at this point, I think at the age of 18 was probably women. That was it. But another friend of mine had also seen the show, and he actually came to the center with me at some time in the future. But at this point, I didn't really know much of it, but I began telling people about Meher Baba. Even though I personally didn't accept it, it was just so intriguing that I began telling people about it. And within a few weeks, a friend of mine said to me, some kids in our class have been to a center for Meher Baba in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And I said, oh, really? And they said, yeah, it was this guy. One was Mark Brosgel and 3 other women. Well, I knew Mark. We'd gone the same grade school and now in the same high school. I didn't really know him well, but I knew who he was. And it's funny because we ended up going to the same college later. But I knew him because I knew him as being the first hippie. He was the first person I heard of who took LSD, in our high school, that is. And he had dropped out, gone out to Haight-Ashbury. And now he was back in Pittsburgh, where this was all taking place. And I thought, well, that's perfectly logical. You go out, you take LSD, and then you're going to follow Meher Baba. That's just like a natural progression. So, but he had dropped out, so he wasn't around. I didn't really know where he was. So I wanted to meet these people, and it wasn't until I think I heard about Baba and this David Susskind show, let's say sometime in May. This is kind of what I think it was. So sometime in June, we were all graduating. And I asked my friend, the entire grade was assembled. So it was like about 500 kids graduating all at once. We were in this civic arena in Pittsburgh where they played hockey and basketball, and that's where our graduation was. And we were there in the morning for a practice, so I asked my friend, can you point out who this people are who went to the center? So she showed me who one of them was. We were all sitting alphabetically, so it was easy to find. And I walked over to her. I remember she was sitting on the aisle. I remember that just now. So it was easy to talk to her. And I asked her, do you know about Mayor Baba? And she said, in a kind of surprise reaction, yes. And she said, would you like to see his photograph? And I said, yeah, because Alan didn't have any pictures of Baba on the TV show. So she took out a little pendant and had Baba's photo on it. And I looked at it. It kind of looked like one of these young hippie pictures. And I said, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. And anyway, I saw Baba's photo for the first time. And then I guess I arranged for her to get more information, so I was able to get discourses from her, went to her home, and she had a painting by Linot there. And she began to tell me that the painting was painted by a blind man. And I was like, oh yeah, right, you know. Another thing I'm not going to believe. So I got a copy of the discourses, and I began to read them. Now, one of the interesting things is looking back on this one chance in a million thought that I had was, what was the probability that in 1968 there would be people in my high school who had been to the center? At that point in 68, there were just a handful of people coming down here. And Pittsburgh was not in the main stream of things. It wasn't New York, it wasn't San Francisco, or places where things were happening. So, you know, I look back and I think, oh yeah, there's like one chance in a million that people in my high school actually ended up coming down here and that I would be able to meet them. So, and that was one of, you'll see as the story unfolds, that was one of those other things that seemed highly unlikely. So, as I got the discourses, I started to read them. And I became intrigued. I was intrigued by the fact that what Baba said was, what we see is not real. This is all an illusion. What's real is what we don't see. And I really kind of liked that idea and talked about infinity and things that were very intriguing. They're kind of like the Twilight Zone, just playing with reality. So I eventually, then I went off to college. And I guess one other thing that happened that summer was, also on television, was a series of talks by Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti, Baba said, was a fifth plane saint, and he had a 10-week series on public television at that time. And I would watch a few of them, and I remember calling another friend saying, you know, I don't know what this guy's talking about, but he's really far out. You got to turn it on. So I watched Krishnamurti a few times. And then my freshman year, I was in the library trying to study, and I get easily distracted, and I turn around, see on the bookshelf right behind me, I see a book by Krishnamurti. And I just opened it up, began reading it. I think I actually sent away and got a copy. And then I was not happy where I was. I was at Kenyon College, which was an all men's college at the time. Decided I needed to get out of that environment and began applying to a bunch of other schools around Christmas time that year. And while I was doing that, I thought, well, I'll send a letter to the center in Myrtle Beach. I had the address. And I will ask for a copy of the discourses. So when I come back second semester, there's a shoebox full of information that came in the mail for me. There were pamphlets, there were the discourses, there was a letter. I think the letter was from Kitty, but I didn't keep the letter, unfortunately. But then I began to continue reading the discourses. So I transferred from the all-men's school to an all-female school. I went to Vassar College, which had just gone co-ed. And I was with a group of about, I don't think it was small. There were 12 guys in our dorm, and there was like about 150 women, something like that. And we had one wing on the first floor, separate from most of the other rooms in there. And Meryl Streep was in my dorm. I had lunch with Meryl Streep one day. She was known as the best actress on campus. So at that point in my life, I did begin to experiment with drugs, particularly marijuana and LSD. The second semester of that year, a fellow moved in right next to me. He'd been in Vietnam, came back, a few years older than I was. And he was a very unusual sort of person. And I kind of struck up friendship with him. Unusual, creative sort of person. Maybe bipolar, but anyway, kind of fun. And at the end of that semester, a fellow down the hall, one of the other guys on the floor, asked me if I had any books on Eastern religions. And I guess I was a target because I was a hippie back then. And I said, well, I have books by a fellow named Meher Baba. The person who had been in Vietnam was in the room next to me. He said, Meher Baba, my grandmother met Meher Baba. And he begins to tell me this story that in 1952, when Baba came to New York, his grandmother wanted to take him to visit Baba. She was going to see Baba. She had not yet met Baba. And they lived in Atlantic City, so they would go up by train or something to, I don't know how they, up to New York. She wanted him not only to meet Baba, but actually go back to India and become a disciple of Baba. He was 5 years old at the time in 1952. That night, this guy, his name was Rick Sykes, had a dream that he was going across the ocean on a train, and the tracks of that train kept going and going and going and never stopped, and he was frightened by it. He woke up that morning, he was supposed to see Baba. He told his grandmother he didn't want to see Baba. So he didn't meet Baba, his grandmother did, but he grew up with a picture of Baba in his room. So I heard all this. Now I hadn't really met anyone now. This is my sophomore year, so since I graduated 2 years earlier, I hadn't really met anyone else who knew about Meher Baba. So when I heard that, his grandmother met Baba, it began to make me think, oh, there are people in the world who actually either follow Baba or are interested in him. And also looking back on it, what was the chance of somebody in my dorm, not only in my dorm, but right in the room right next to me, whose grandmother had met Baba. And in the 50s, there were just a couple hundred people that would come down to the center, and maybe 1,000 people all around the country who met Baba. So that was another one chance in a million type of thing. Now all this seemed perfectly natural as I was living through it. It wasn't until many years later I began to look back and say, oh yeah, it's really unusual, highly unlikely that these things happened. So I actually at times felt maybe Baba was communicating to me through this guy, Richard Sykes. Particularly one time when I was tripping and I saw him gesturing with his hands when he was in the car and he talked, which this guy, Richard Sykes, and I was thinking, oh, Meher Baba used gestures. Anyway, you can think of all sorts of interesting things when you're taking LSD. At the same time, I was in school, I was studying things like Plato and Freud and different things. And anything I learned seemed to make, when I put it in the context of what I was reading, the discourses made sense. So everything, Baba became the framework through which I was beginning to understand everything. And what happened the third year was a professor had come on campus who taught the history of religions. And he was unusual because he had studied religions by living in countries and studied the religion while in the country. So he had lived in Egypt for a while to learn about the Muslim religion. He'd lived in India for a while to study Hinduism. He had a Tibetan master who was living in Switzerland, and he had been to Zen monasteries in Japan. And he was known as being this kind of a very inspired teacher. So I took, my junior year now, I took a course with him. And I would sit there and I would, really be mesmerized by him. And the buzz on campus was that he had obtained nirvana. That he was so high, had attained nirvana. Um, we learned different religions by basically studying the lives of the founders of the religion. So we learned about Muhammad's life and a little bit about the philosophy. We studied Buddha's life and some of the philosophy, a little bit about Krishna and Hindu philosophy. And I liked the class because we didn't have any homework. He wanted us to suspend our beliefs, immerse ourselves in the religion for 6 weeks, keep a journal, and just to keep a journal, see what the experience was. He also had this ability that when he spoke, to make people think he was speaking directly to them. So I would sit in class and think, oh, he's saying this for my benefit. And other people in the class were having similar experiences. He was a very charismatic, very, very nice guy, and seemed to be high, intoxicated almost with this. He had a great love for these subjects. So one day after class, I decided to ask him about Meher Baba, and said, do you know about Meher Baba? And he said, oh yeah, I have a great deal of respect for Meher Baba. He had previously taught at Duke in North Carolina, and he said one of his students told him about a center in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and he and his student came down to spend a week here and met these two delightful older ladies on the center, which were mostly, Kitty and Elizabeth, and he had deep respect for Meher Baba. So when I heard that made me feel much more confident in who Baba was, because I took him to be an authority. I took him to be somebody who really knew about religion and spirituality, and if he respected Baba, that meant something to me. So, looking back on that also, what was the probability of having a professor in college who was so steeped in spirituality, practiced Tibetan Buddhist meditation, had been in Zen monasteries, knew all the religions of the world, and also spent a week on the center. That was another like one chance in a million type of thing. So at this point, I had been telling people about Baba, and I remember one friend of mine, Seth, we would smoke dope together, and I lent him the discourses, and I remember giving it to him, and the thing was all basically underlined with yellow marker. Everything. Anytime something interested me, I would mark it with a yellow marker. So my roommate began to have somewhat of an interest in it, in Baba, and he lived in Fort Worth, Texas, and Vassar was in Poughkeepsie, New York, and he had a little VW Beetle that he would drive Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter from Poughkeepsie, New York to Texas. And he said, well, I'll just swing down through Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. It was like maybe an extra 500 to 1,000 extra miles, I don't know what, to come this way. Probably an extra 500 miles. And he came down, over Christmas break, spent a couple nights on the center, came back. And when I asked him about it, he said, there's cabins for people to stay in, it's nice. And he met a man who's blind, and he paints pictures of Meher Baba. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Maybe that's true. And anyway, I became interested, and I thought, I wanted to come down. So a group of us came down, including my roommate, who'd been here once before, Rick Sykes, whose grandmother had met Baba, me, Seth, who developed an interest in Baba and became a Sufi out in. Okay. So this group of 6 of us, it was like 5 guys and 1 woman, drove from Vassar down to the center, and it was like spring break, Easter break, 1971. So we got here on a Saturday, and I guess Marshall makes the typical announcement that Baba's house will be open tomorrow from 11 to 1. And I heard that. I was in the habit of sleeping in till noon, staying up till like 3 at night, smoking American dope, and then getting up in time to go to lunch. So getting up at 11 seemed something I didn't really want to do. But by 9:30, there was a lot of noise in the cabin, it was in the green cabin. And I guess everyone else had gotten up by 9:30, and I thought, well, I'll probably never come back here again. So, well, one Rome do as the Romans, I'll go over and see this Baba's house. My roommate had told me there's some like sandals and clothes that Mayor Baba wore. That stuff never really interested me. I was much more into the ideas and things at this time anyway. So, but I made it over to Baba's house. And I don't really remember a tour, being with probably Jane Haynes at the time. But I did have this powerful experience. So I remember being in Baba's bedroom, and I began having an inward dialogue with Baba. I should preface and say, one of the things I was also interested in was meditation. So I didn't want to pay $35 to TM to learn how to do transcendental meditation, but Baba wrote about meditation in the discourses, so I began to read those discourses and began to meditate. And I had a knack for meditating. So when I go into Baba's bedroom, I begin this inward dialogue with him. And first thing I thought was inwardly saying to Baba, if you're anywhere, you're here in this room right now. Now, I don't really know, this was not premeditated, I don't know exactly what made me say that, but obviously I was feeling something of his presence in the room without realizing it. Then I said, I have to learn to love you the way a woman loves a man. And again, I was like, I don't know where that came from, I don't know, other than that Baba said we had to love him. And he was a guy, and I was a guy, and that wasn't going to work. So I felt I had to learn to love him the way a woman loves a man, because women know how to love, and guys don't really know how to love. And then I said, now I'm going to make my mind silent. And because I had this knack for meditating, I just stopped thinking. When I did, I heard and felt a vibration. It was like it was coming out of the walls. It was audible, and it was vibratory. I could feel it. And again, it seemed perfectly natural. It didn't seem unnatural whatsoever. And I probably just stayed in the room for a few minutes, and kind of absorbed myself in the experience. And then I walked out of the room. I sat outside on the porch on the steps, and I began to put my shoes on. Somebody sat down next to me, and they said, "Did you hear that?" And I said, yeah, I heard it. And they said it sounded like a jet plane had flown through the room. And I said, yeah, that's right. And all this time I was wanting to remain absorbed in the experience. I never looked at who it was, and it was kind of arrogant and just acted nonchalantly. I didn't really have any exchange with him, and I just kind of got up and walked away. Looking back on it many years later, I realized that if that person hadn't said that, I would assume it had been my imagination looking back on it from this vantage point. But since somebody else had the same experience, I realized that it was not my imagination. So, what did happen was I stayed, I think, a week. And when I got back and told my friends from high school back in Pittsburgh what my experience was, I said, what's amazing was that everyone was happy there. No one was doing drugs. And it was like the opener that you didn't need to do drugs in order to be happy. And looking back, that experience I had in Baba's bedroom was very powerful. But even more powerful was the love that I felt. And that made a difference. So that was the thing that opened me up to Baba. So I could add a little more, another story, which came just a couple months later. So this is like spring break. So I did LSD 2 more times after being at the center. And the last time I meditated the entire time, or for part of it. And that was a problem. I remember opening up, I had a suitcase packed because I was leaving the next day, and there was a picture of Baba there that I had. I meditated on the photo. So when I got back to home, I told my parents that I wanted to drop out of school. This is not my junior year. And I wanted to go to live in Myrtle Beach. And my parents flipped out. I'd been pre-med, I should have been a doctor. Now I'm going to, and then I began to explain to them about Meher Baba. And I said, he's God. And I took out God Speaks, which I just got. I showed them the planes of consciousness. And you won't believe it, they didn't get it. They just like, it's like, what a way to introduce Baba. It was like, opening up God Speaks. So they began to like freak out because I was really strange because I would sit at the dining room table and eat dinner, and I would just kind of stare out in space. And I was like, every time I tried to meditate, the LSD kind of came back, but it wasn't pleasant, and it was becoming a very hellish experience for that period of time. And so it finally got to, I had a bank account. I had about $5,000 in this bank account from bar mitzvah money that I had, and other birthday gifts and things. I was going to take that money and live in Myrtle Beach for a year. And I wanted to write, and I was going to paint, I was going to dance, I was going to do all this artistic stuff. And the bank, it was a custodial account, and it required my dad's signature. And my dad was not going to do that. So they said, but if you have a birth certificate and come in, that should be adequate. So I went down and got a birth certificate. And I came home one day, and my dad never would come home at lunch. He'd always eat lunch with one of my uncles or other people from the business they had. So as I said, my parents were really, really upset with me for dropping out of school. So my dad came home and said, are you still planning on doing this, going to the bank and going to Myrtle Beach? And I said, yes. He got really angry, and he went to the kitchen, and he opened up the phone book, ran out of the house. I went to the kitchen, looked at the phone book. It was turned to private detectives. So, this is strange. So I decided I better act quickly, so I went to the bank. Now my dad was a business guy in Pittsburgh, and he knew bankers, and I think he called the bank because when I went in there, I said I wanted to get this money out of my account. The teller said, wait a minute. And then she went back, talked to somebody, and they said, sorry, we can't do this today. Even though I had my birth certificate with me. And now I didn't know what I was going to do. So I went to this fellow who I just met. His name was Dennis Portnoy. I guess I got his name from the center of us to a Baba person in Pittsburgh. And Dennis had a health food store that he just opened this is now 1971. So I went to visit his store, and he told me his story about his parents and how happy his parents were that he followed Meher Baba because he had been on heroin and gave up using heroin because of Baba. So his parents were really delighted with Baba. So anyway, I go home, and my dad comes back from work, and I try to avoid him, but he sees me, and I feel like I lost face. He won, I lost. He comes in, he says, well, maybe there is some good to this Meher Baba, to my surprise. He says, I called the center in Myrtle Beach and spoke to a lady. She seemed to be really intelligent. Her name was Elizabeth Patterson. And she suggested that we all come down to the center. And he said, if it's okay with you, I made reservations for next month, and we'll all fly down, meaning my mother and I and my dad. And I said, well, you want to go down? I'll go down. I don't care. I was pretty arrogant. So anyway, we did. We came down. And I stayed on the center. They stayed in a motel. I think the Thunderbird Motel. It's one of the few around. And but as soon as we got here, they immediately, Marcia was at the gateway. They immediately rushed us over to see Kitty. I think, now, I'll just give a little background. I didn't know this till many years later what happened with my dad, because he came back to the office really disturbed after looking for private detectives and all this thing. Talked to my uncle, one of my two uncles who worked with my dad. My one uncle, Harry, said to him, "What do you know about Mayor Baba?" Now, this uncle was a little bit more liberal or more progressive in his thinking. He had actually taken TM training. So my dad said, "Well, I really don't know that much." I think my dad thought it was a communist conspiracy. So my uncle suggested that he find out. So my dad was pretty resourceful. He got information from Myrtle Beach, got the phone number, called the center, talked to Elizabeth. Elizabeth said, "Come down." We did. Anyway, Elizabeth and Jane weren't there. They were on a cruise, I think either Russia or China, actually, which is funny, since the communist connection. But anyway, we got over to see Kitty. And Kitty looks at me and she says, "You've been meditating a lot, haven't you?" Now I thought, oh, she could tell, because I must have a spiritual aura or something. Kitty said, "That's not Baba's way. Baba's way is through love and service. You mustn't meditate so much." Now that delighted my parents because I was really strange and at that point, and as I said, just staring off at the dinner table. Then she said, "Now, what are you doing with your life?" I said, "Well, I just dropped out of college and I started taking some dance classes and I was wanting to go to a Zen monastery." And she said, "Oh, Baba would want you to continue with what you started, finish what you started. You must go back to school." Now that really delighted my parents because they wanted me to go back to school. And then she said to them, "Now, he's going to follow Mayor Baba for the rest of his life, and there's absolutely nothing that you can do about that." And I didn't realize it, but that's what my heart really wanted. And proved true. And she basically, Kitty, in about 5 minutes, did family therapy, made everyone happy. My parents, she talked about herself, talked about her, did a little name dropping with her, Aunt Florence Nightingale and other things about her life. And a little bit about Baba, and my parents came out and said, "She's quite an amazing person." I said, "Of course she is. She lived with Mayor Baba for a number of years." I didn't quite have the vantage point that my parents had, having lived many years, and really could recognize an amazing soul when I saw one. So anyway, it really did settle things between us, and about 8 years later, we came down, and my parents came with my wife Lori and I, our kids, and Kitty remembered the entire conversation about 8 years later. Really impressed them. So anyway, that's my story of coming to Baba.